snacks, back in the winter before lunch. But we now have Joellen Williams, and Joellen is a special collections curator in the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books here at Kennesaw State University. It's right upstairs, so if you ever had a chance, wow, this is so cool. It's really awesome. She has a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Georgia, and also a master's in archival studies from Penn State University. And she has some materials for us today. It is from the Cherokee Archive exhibit, which I think
Thanks so much for the introduction. So I'm going to make a very short presentation because I want us to be able to have a chance to look at some materials that we have here at KSU in our archive collection. And I also want us to be able to have a little bit of dialogue as well. Okay? So the first thing I'd like to ask you all is what happened yesterday. I would like to, we danced, okay. What happened yesterday for you?
I went to work.
You went to work. Yesterday, I went to work, and then I went to an exhibition opening at the Tellus Museum. Anybody else have something? What happened yesterday?
I went to the Atlanta Opera.
Awesome. I went to the Atlanta Opera. As you can see, what happened yesterday, it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on whose perspective. And that is exactly how history is constructed. People always get kind of funny when I ask that. I think it's a trick question. I'm like, oh, did I miss something major that happened yesterday? But I'm just asking what happened to you yesterday. It's different for all of us. And then especially it's relevant when we're talking about the history of marginalized groups, because it leads us into this idea of voices and silences. Because as you saw, history, what happened in the past, is different for everyone. However, we have this thing called history that, it's supposed to be a record, the record of what happened. But what we have are a lot of times gaps in terms of voices, and we have people that have been silenced, and people that have been forgotten, or people that have been erased through history for various reasons. We also have an issue, and sometimes we don't even notice it. We have an issue, we may have records, and we say, oh, well, these people are represented in history. I see them in my textbook, or I see them in this archives collection. However, there's a difference between records created about a community and records created by a community. Are these records, are these people being represented the way they want to be? Are they being talked about? Are they telling us how they feel, or is someone writing for them or speaking for them? So those are all questions. Who determines the historic record? There's a debate. But I'd like to discuss the role of archivists in that, because that's what I'm an archivist and a curator. I like this quote by an archivist that I really respect. He's no longer living. His name was Terry Cook, and he said, as archivists document modern society and its institutions, they control the past. They shape to a major degree what society can know about itself. They choose and preserve, or ignore and destroy, recorded evidence of past precedents and societal ideas that are essential to inform the present and guide the future. So we often don't think about that. Sometimes it can be like, oh, well, I think my textbook probably taught me what I know about certain people, or maybe a historian teaches me, and those are all true. But archivists, those who are actually deciding what needs to be kept and what needs to be preserved, they're also playing a role in the historic record. And that brings up, there's been a lot of issues in the archival community regarding Native American history and the archival landscape for a variety of reasons, and we don't even have time to get into all of them, but we're going to talk about a couple. So I'm going to give you, this is a really interesting text, by the way. It's called Caring for American Indian Objects, and it's written for archivists and museum curators. And this text, there's a really interesting quote here by the writer, and she says, American Indian cultural items, like most things, deteriorate over time. If you didn't know, we're all deteriorating. We're all made of carbon, we're organic, we're all deteriorating. So you can't, archivists, we can't do anything to stop deterioration, but we can just try to slow it down. So like everything else, Native American materials deteriorate. The deterioration cannot be stopped. It can be slowed or rapid, or it can be rapidly, depending on the materials from which the items are made, et cetera, et cetera. But then she says something that's a little bit interesting. Standard museum practice suggests several procedures to slow deterioration of all types of items. Standard practice, however, often fails to take into account cultural considerations. Okay, so that's an issue. As educators and archivists, and we learn standard ways to preserve things, what works, what doesn't, what you need to do to preserve this type of material, and how you need to do it, and what temperature it needs to be at, and X, Y, and Z. However, when you're dealing with artifacts that have cultural significance to a people, such as Native Americans, and largely significance that many people don't know, it can be problematic. Okay? So museum staff and archivists tend to want to apply the same rules they learn for everything to also Native American materials, and that has created issues of ownership, copyright. It has strained relationships between cultural heritage professionals and American Indians. So just as a legal consideration, some of you may have heard of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 that George H.W. Bush signed. So what this did is kind of change the game a little bit, because what it did was it asked museums to re-examine and catalog and inform Native American communities about objects that museums and archives held in their collections. Because what happened was, a lot of museums and archives were in possession of Native American materials for a long time, and they got them from sometimes very questionable ways back in the day. And they were just holding on to them, and it's not theirs. It wasn't theirs. And so this was a way to at least make funeral objects, sacred objects, cultural patrimony, human remains, to make that known, and then to decide that it would be up to the specific Native American community to decide what they wanted to do with that. So there were some issues. Anyone who knows a museum curator and archivist, we don't usually like to give up stuff that we have in our collection. So there were some issues there, but it did begin some important dialogues. However, there are a lot of things that don't fall under this law, like clothing, hunting tools, household utensils, maybe non-sacred ceremonial objects. So there were some, still some things that kind of fell through the cracks there. And another consideration, some of you may not have heard of the Society of American Archivists, but that is the organization, the big national organization of archivists for the United States and Canada. And a group of archivists in 2007 actually developed a humongous document of protocols. And these protocols were meant to help archivists figure out how to properly preserve and represent Native American materials. Well, it was a big issue because the Society of American Archivists would not endorse it for a long time. There was a lot of controversy around it. I think a lot of archivists were like, well, why are these people telling me how I can deal with my collections and X, Y, and Z, all that was happening. Finally, though, in 2018, Society of American Archivists did endorse it. It is I'm not going to talk too much about it because it's very in-depth, but it's a really, really good guide for archivists so we can understand what are some things we need to consider when we are exhibiting this material and preserving it. So we have some materials related to Native Americans, specifically Cherokee, here at KSU in the KSU archives. It was really acquired as part of our rare book collection, but it's kind of all basically part of KSU's archives collection. So, of course, it's such interesting materials, and of course, when you're an archivist and you're a curator, you're like, I want to do an exhibit, this needs to be shared. So I go to my desk and I'm like, oh dear, how do I, as an archivist and curator of non-Native American descent, respectfully preserve, interpret, and exhibit these materials? You know, I kind of realized I'm not exactly sure I know what I'm doing here. And so I was like, well, I think the best thing to do would be to ask for help. And so that's what I did in May 2017. I wrote a proposal and I received a grant from SAA called a Strategic Growth Grant. And basically it was a grant to fund a workshop to bring Native American community members, whoever wanted to come, and put them in the same room as scholars and other museum professionals and archivists here in the area, and see what can we come up with about, what are some ideas at least, what are some things I should consider when I'm developing this exhibit so that I would like to make in the future. It was a really awesome, it was a day-long workshop, a little bit shorter than this, but we had a great group discussion. We had a show and tell, we did a tour of the archives, we had a guest speaker who's a Cherokee language expert come and spoke some Cherokee for us, and so it was a really, really good time. But I think the biggest thing we did, we had a big community curation workshop, and we just threw out ideas. These are just a couple pictures from the event when we kind of talked together, doing focus questions, looked at some materials. This is Frank Brannon, who's from Virginia, who is doing his talk. Again, Cherokee language expert. So it was a really, really great program. So the workshop results and themes are things that I plan to take into my exhibit thoughts. These are just, so many things were said and we talked about, but these were a couple things. One is to maintain a local and narrow scope. Native American history, as you all know, is vast, it's complex, there's no one story. However, with this exhibit, I've decided I think we're going to maintain a very local scope. So probably focus on Cherokee, Northwest Georgia area, focus on what our collections can support. We don't need to try to tell every story. We can just try to tell the story that we have here in our collections and focus on that. One of the things was to represent Indigenous people as active agents in our world. One of the things that a professor, and I think you'll meet her today, Dr. Miriam Brown-Spires, she was mentioning that she's noticed a lot of times in museums and in archives, maybe without meaning to, the curators often represent Native Americans as people who used to live, or as relics, or as almost an extinct species, because they focus so heavily on, maybe life prior to removal or prior to, it's an issue that, especially for young people, when they see that in museums, may not realize that Native American communities are still creating fiction, poetry, they're speaking. And so we need to make sure that we represent them as active agents. We need to collaborate. I plan to collaborate with other repositories and communities in Georgia. As y'all know, we've got New Echota up there. We've got the Etowah Indian Mountains. We've got a lot of different places that do this already. The Funk Heritage Center at Reinhardt. So there's a lot of places here that collaboration is really what makes exhibits do well. We're going to include a multitude of stories in this exhibit. I'm really going to try to focus on the idea of the print culture in the Cherokee Nation, because that's what we've been collecting, and I think that's pretty unique. So we're going to focus mostly on that and the voices that appear in print. And then also we are going to resist the urge to focus super heavily on Native American removal, because that is an issue I know as well that people have mentioned in the workshop, that's something that is often just focused on, but there's more than that in Cherokee history specifically. So my next step is to rework the exhibit timeline. I wanted to open the exhibit this year, but we'll have to see based on some of our other exhibitions that we do in our department. I think it may have to probably be next year, but that's okay. As I said, I want to focus on the 19th century, focus on the printed word and the multitude of voices that appear there. So I'm still teasing all of that out, but I think we're going to focus on print. I want to include still oral history tradition, but I think we want to focus on the idea of the Cherokee language and how unique that is and kind of the role that played in Georgia history. I'm thinking that's what we're probably going to do. I'm also kind of going forth and teasing out which space to use. For those of you who know this library, we have a space upstairs called the Athenaeum Gallery, which is kind of a large gallery space. However, this might be something for our Rare Book Museum, which is on the basement floor. So again, trying to figure out which space it would be better. New acquisitions and purchases, purchasing new things that might work for this exhibit. So that involves a lot of research and networking. So I'm very excited. This is just kind of my initial thoughts about it. After the kind of have had a chance to digest the workshop, do some additional research, but I'm really excited to make this work. And so I wanted to just give an update on how that is going. And just in the interest of time, I would love to take a few questions, but then I really want us to just come up and see a couple materials that we have here in the KSU archives regarding Cherokee history. And I'd like to see, these are a couple of things that I definitely would plan to put in the exhibition, along with other things that might fit things that I might purchase. This is not all that we have anyway, so there'll still be more room for other things. I'd love to take a few questions if anyone has. Sure.
Here's about the community that you have formed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you also deal with creating or adding new metadata for others across the nation to be able to pull from?
You know, I haven't gotten there yet, and that's something that that's a great question, because what we want to do, and this is something that we often do with exhibits, what we would do is not only create an exhibit, we would actually create a finding aid of our collection. So a finding aid is basically kind of similar to like a library catalog record, but for archives collections. And we would add that to our catalog, and that way we would be able to share, and I would be able to have extensive metadata about these pieces, and that would it would coincide with the exhibition. But I think you're right; that's what's going to be lasting.
I mean, not to standardize, but at least to have a baseline.
Exactly, I think that's exactly right. You know, to really have something that is a it falls in line with metadata standards, and it'll be easily searchable for people to see what we have and maybe connect with things that other repositories have. So that's a great point. Yes.
A few years ago, the Smithsonian Institute returned some artifacts to the Telescience Center in Hardersville. My first question, number one, did you get a chance to visit that exhibit? And then number two, in terms of the Native American Graves and Reparations Act, there's a little loophole. And unfortunately, the Smithsonian and all of their affiliates are exempt, so they don't have to return.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's
I
fascinating.
found that out doing some research for a book that I wrote.
Very interesting. I was just at the
I just wanted your
Telescience.
opinion on what if you visited the exhibit, and then number one, what your thought is about that little loophole.
I was just at the Telus yesterday. I was looking, but I was there for an exhibition opening of a different exhibit that we helped them with. And so I don't think I'm familiar with the pieces that you're discussing, but that is very interesting. I just didn't know that about the Smithsonian. It doesn't really surprise me. But I did not know that. So that is something that can be quite problematic, especially since they tend to have, institutions like that will tend to have large collections and of those materials. So again, I know that's problematic. I just didn't know that. So it's very interesting. Yes.
I have two questions. Do you guys have a climate control room
We
on
do.
campus? Yeah?
We do. So upstairs in our KSU archives collection, we've got a climate control area, and then also downstairs, you may not have seen it, but to the basement floor, our rare book collection is even more climate control. So everything is in climate and humidity control area. So yeah, that helps.
And I'm from upstate in Corning, and actually the history club where I'm at. And we were fortunate enough. One of our positions is an archivist, and it's a novice, But we were able to find someone who knew a little metadata work and was able to catalog digitally a lot of our stuff up there. It took time, it took a couple of years, but it was cool when it was done. And the last question, which is the first question I actually wanted to ask, is there like a network of traveling collegiate exhibits? So I feel like some collections can get stuck at home, right? And maybe if they have more circulatory life.
And that's a really awesome question. Now, in terms of understanding the landscape of like collections that exist in the US that are archives collections, there's not really anything that is just like, this is a thing to go to.
Right.
One thing though that is pretty much the best thing out there is called Archive Grid. And it's basically, it's probably the biggest, I think, collection, or I guess, compilation of collections that exist in repositories throughout the US. Not everybody participates, but a lot do. So what that is gonna do, it's gonna kind of link you to, you can do lots of different searching, keyword searching, and it'll link you, like if you like, I don't know, if you just put in there, like Native American, African American, you get a lot of hits, and it would link you to different repositories that have collections related to that. Now, in terms of exhibits, a lot of repositories now, what they're doing, what we're actually gonna do too, is because it's hard sometimes to make exhibits travel, what we do is, while we do a standing exhibit in our local area, we also have a digital exhibit as well. And so I think a digital component is extremely important for these kinds of exhibits so that people can find them. Even if they're doing Google searches, maybe they'll come up on it. And so that is something that I know a lot of archives are doing now. It's a good question.
I actually had a question that was related to that. I was going to ask, because I've used Archive Grid and some other sources for archival research before, and most of the stuff is really at the local archive collection. So is there a way that you recommend to find stuff that is available digitally so you can still learn about what's out there in archives without having to travel across the country to visit?
Yeah, in terms of, and that's a great point. In terms of finding, I'm thinking of a site or a database of digital exhibits, and I'm not sure I know of one. What I usually do is kind of, I'm thinking about what am I trying to research, and I think about who may have these records. I had a student actually in a class. I was doing Introduction to Archives, talking about the KSU archives, and he's like, "Do you have any records about the Salem witch trials?" And I was like, "That's a great question. We have absolutely nothing on that because that's not what we collect here." So what I try to do first is think about, okay, like I'm working for Salem witch trials. Where can I think? Boston Historical Society, like UMass, or somebody might probably has things like that. And then I'll go to their sites and have to search through like their digital collections and see if there's anything that I can get without having to go there. If not, contact the archivist directly and see, do you know of other, because I don't think there's really, to my knowledge, something that's like a good resource for just like digital exhibits that exist. So good question.
In a related matter too, you mentioned the collections and you mentioned the findings from the workshop that seem to speak also to the needs of educators, how to make these collections relevant and integrate them into the classroom. Are there plans for, providing instructor resources to that to amplify the treasures for application so that they become integrated into teaching?
Thank you for that question. One thing that in our department, we have the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, and they're really good at that. They always create teacher guides whenever they do exhibits. They do traveling exhibits. They're made for that. This one, I don't think I really could do too much that could travel unless I got some things on loan. However, creating teacher guides, we have a huge book eye scanner, being able to use, and maybe even doing something where the teacher guide coincided with things that we've digitized in our digital component, I think that would work out great. And I think that's something that would be so useful to our local communities and maybe to others. So I think like thank you for reminding me, creating teacher resources is.
And it could be a collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. 'Cause I need to probably brush up on what do students need to know, and it would definitely need to be collaborative.
According to the standard.
Exactly. There's a,
I just really appreciate the work with the workshop. I think that's a wonderful idea. I was wondering if in the course of the conversation of the workshop, members who were there from different Native nations or archives asked about the transference of some of the materials you have to their institutions and how do you discuss that?
you know, it was interesting. No one really talked about that much, which is very fascinating. Now, some people, what we did talk about, some people, again, they didn't do this at first, but after they got to know me and after they kind of had some conversations, said, you know, I have some things that I think might be useful for your exhibit. And so we did talk about maybe having some things on loan. And I think that's what also I really wanted as well, because I didn't want this to be and I'm not gonna, you know, push or anything, and anyone who, you know, came, I didn't want to push it too hard. But one thing I would love for this exhibit is to not just be things that the KSU Archives acquires. I would love it to be more literally a community curated exhibit where I can say like this, you know, this material is from so-and-so who lives in Cherokee County, lives in Cobb County, or, you know, lives in Bartow, and that's what I want. And so I really wanted it to be a lot of sharing. I didn't want anyone to think I was like a vulture, you know, trying to like get things, so I didn't want to push it, but that's actually my goal. So, and that takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of trust building, and so, you know, because people want to make sure that you're representing them, that's why I wanted them to be involved in the beginning. So, thank you for that question. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so much. Please come and take a look at some of these materials. We've got a Cherokee Phoenix newspaper from 1830. We've got some examples of Cherokee printing, some translations. We've got a Cherokee hymn book, translations of the book of Matthew and different biblical pieces into the Cherokee syllabary, and some other documents. So please come up and feel free to take a look. But thank you for your time. It's bilingual. You know, and I've never,
families, and groups in crisis. Her focus is working with target populations, including adults suffering from substance abuse, adults with significant disabilities, and foster care communities. Jill graduated from South Carolina State University with her bachelor's degree in social work. She continued to study clinical social work and organizational community planning at University of New England with her master's in social work degree. And her presentation today is mental health and trauma in the African American community. So welcome.
Thank you. How's everybody doing this morning? Good morning. Just to give a little bit more background, again, my name is Angel Hop. I currently work in a psychiatric facility. Currently, I do groups with substance abuse clients. Typically, the clients are dual diagnosis. Just to give a little bit more of a current background where I am. So today, I'm going to talk to you about generational trauma in the Black community. So first, just going over a general overview, what is mental health, and we're going to talk about the definition of mental illness. We're also going to define what is trauma, what is generational trauma, also post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic slave syndrome. We're also going to look at a closer study in reference to a case study and the application of post-traumatic stress disorder, and also some concrete skills about what you can do. Okay, so defining mental health. Mental health is a state of well-being. It realizes your own potential, copes with normal stresses of life, and the contributions to your community. Mental illness is the changes in thinking, emotion, and behavior, or you can see a combination. This is associated with stress, problems functioning at work, family, and social activity. African Americans are 10% more likely to report serious psychological distress than non-Hispanic whites. So defining trauma is the emotional response to a life event. The example could be a car accident, natural disaster, or rape. Some of the long-term effects could be unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, or somatic symptoms. The example would be nausea or headache. So with going a little bit more in depth to talk about trauma, there are two types. We're going to start with type 1, which is considered acute trauma, which is the single exposure to the overwhelming event. And type 2 would be complex trauma, which is the extended exposure. It's important to note that when you're treating trauma with a client, two things that are important are safety, as well as the ability and time to be able to heal from the traumatic event. And also with treating complex trauma, diverse interventions and approaches are necessary. The example that I provided is interpersonal therapy, which is brief sessions, and we're going to cover that a little bit later on in the slides. So next we're going to define intergenerational versus transgenerational trauma. So both are classified under as complex trauma, which is type 2. So intergenerational trauma is the effects of the primary family of the initial exposure. Each family will experience their own form of trauma and can be traced back for decades. Transgenerational trauma is the transference of emotional and physical pain from one person to another. African Americans who experience racism may experience symptoms compatible with post-traumatic stress disorder. So for this slide, notice the picture. The picture is just someone skipping rocks. I use this picture to illustrate a general example to give you more of a concrete understanding in reference to intergenerational trauma versus transgenerational trauma. Now, intergenerational trauma is the initial exposure to the event and how the family is interacting with it, but you're also looking at the first generation, second generation, and third generation in response to the intergenerational trauma. Now, the transgenerational trauma is looking at the exposure to the family in relation to the traumatic event after 3 generations that's passed. So going back to the picture, the initial exposure to the traumatic event would be the rock creating the initial ripple, which is in the bottom right corner of the picture. And then notice how the rock is still traveling throughout the water and how it's hovering over the water about to create a fourth ripple. In this case, the intergenerational trauma would start with the first ripple at the beginning and see how it's creating 3 to 4 different effects. The transgenerational trauma is the movement of the rock in this picture. So again, the intergenerational trauma, you're looking at the event and how it's creating the ripples in the water. And the transgenerational trauma is more so the movement of the rock and how it impacts each space in the water. Post-traumatic stress disorder. The definition directly experiences, witnesses, or repeatedly witnesses extreme exposure to adverse events. Symptoms typically are present for more than 1 month in duration. Black female veterans are measured higher for paranoia and ideas of persecution. persecution. So going a little bit more in depth in reference to some of the symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, you can see intrusive symptoms, which could be replaying traumatic events. Some of the examples would be nightmares or flashbacks, as previously defined in complex trauma, or dissociative symptoms, which is not remembering key aspects of the traumatic event, avoidance symptoms, which are the limited access to memories or reminders of the associated feeling and thoughts. Adult Black/African Americans are more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than are adult whites. So going into a little bit of more of a concrete understanding of intrusive symptoms, it's more so when you're in the here and now setting, you're interrupted with moments in terms of flashbacks and nightmares that may put you in a reminder of what may previously happened. And looking into disassociative symptoms, not remembering key aspects. So an example of that would be if you're somebody who experienced a traumatic event where you were kidnapped and raped, you're having no memory of the kidnapping, almost as though it didn't happen. So that's more of the dissociative symptoms that you're going to see. And the avoidance symptom is more so you're able to recall the vague symptoms of what may have happened to you, almost like recalling a fog. But instead of when the symptoms become more apparent in terms of what's happening to you, the more apparent it comes, you're almost changing the subject, you might leave the room, and you're completely making a turnaround to avoid talking about it more concrete, those details to come. So that's more of explaining a little bit more in terms of the avoidance symptoms. Going into the next slide, post-traumatic slave syndrome is a theory of etiology of behaviors, adaptive behaviors of the African American community and diaspora, presenting conditions that exist generationally. A sense of Black identity can neutralize symptoms of anxiety and depression, but cannot exclusively protect from discrimination. So I included this statement only because when you're able to understand and appreciate and love your Black self, that does not completely absolve you from your unique relationship to discrimination. It only provides a sense of resilience to be able to deal with the unique relationship that you're going to have to discrimination. For this slide, I included this picture, which shows a series of different ships that are shown in a festival in Hampton Roads, Virginia, called Harbor Fest. Okay, and so these ships are, some of them are commercial use, some of them are just recreational, but the purpose of this picture is because at this festival, they show slave ships that are replicas as well as historical ships that were just painted over and were recreated so people can step onto the ships and basically get an idea of what the slave ships look like. Now, by the time Virginia Pilot ends up talking about the story of Harbor Fest in reference to how the ships were used at that period of time, they sanitize the story. So they'll say things in the paper in reference to how the ships were used to transport different cargo, whether it's spices or whether it's cloth, but they won't speak to the human cargo in reference to how it's used. And by the time you go to Harbor Fest, they're putting the replicas right beside the actual artifacts of the historical ships that are being used. So you're not able to tell, and there's no pointing them out to you as well. So that's one of the ways that they get to sanitize as well as hide behind those stories as well. So with going into a little bit more to understand how post-traumatic stress disorder works, as well as how complex trauma and how the transference of that works, we're going to look at a case study. And the case study is a person named Karen. So Karen is a 43-year-old officer in the United States Army. She was sexually harassed by her supervising officer. The sexual harassment was manifested through nude photos, pursuing a personal relationship. The supervising officer was reprimanded and eventually retired early. Karen was accused of malingering and was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. She was stationed with a junior officer in another work site. The junior officer sexually harassed other women. This did not include Karen in that sexual harassment, but Karen confronted and slapped the officer. Karen ended her service 1 year later and pursued mental health treatment, and the therapist diagnosed Karen with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a baseline example to understand how post-traumatic stress disorder works. In reference to this case, the traumatic event would be sexual harassment, and you would see it play out in reference to her interpersonal relationships in terms of, you see some of the dysfunctional relationships she's having with her peers, as well as how it's playing out with her new supervisor, noticing how she's fixating on different emotions while she's still doing her job. And the other supervisor that was initially inviting her into sexual harassment place, how even though he was removed, she was still hovering in that space of not being able to fully cope with some of her emotional responses, so much so where it was playing out in different work sites. And so you're seeing a lot of the transference and the unresolved emotion. You're seeing that even though she was displaying some symptoms of major depression, that wasn't quite accurate to speak to the initial traumatic event in which she experienced. So going into a little bit of the treatment for Karen, one of the treatment pieces that was used is interpersonal therapy. This is a brief component to therapy. It was 14 sessions. It was about 60 minutes once a week. And so the rationale the therapist used was it was to connect the past experience that was affecting her interpersonal functioning, and that's something that was shown in the example because she was having dysfunctional communication with people that she was working around, and it played out in her work environment as well as in terms of her being able to function. And so this was used as a means to explore the link between her current feelings and unresolved feelings, as also a means to understand her current life events. But this was only after following the agreement of the client for the direction of treatment. These things are essential because even when you're trying to treat complex trauma, you still have to have an idea of what you want as a client to come in the door, because the therapist is going to be able to make an assessment on what they see based off of whatever traumatic event that you tell them, and they're going to be able to tailor their treatment around you. So even though the sessions were really brief, the complexity of her trauma still was addressed, but this was only following the agreement after the client in terms of the direction of treatment of where they wanted to go. So what can you do? So this is basically a slide to talk about what are some concrete skills after talking a little bit about the case study. How can I use that to apply it to my own life? So know the definition of mental health and mental illness, know what those things are, and ask more questions about that. This is not to say go out and misdiagnose or try to self-diagnose. That's not what I'm suggesting. But know where to go in order to find the most credible definition. So World Health Organization is really good, as well as the American Psychiatric Association. Also, it's really important to know where your baseline is. The way that you get there is by asking two key questions: what is my normal and where is my balance? What you'll notice is what's normal for you is not going to be normal for the person next to you. And so with understanding that, you want to be able to move to the next question and say, where is my balance? If my routine is normally hectic and I'm all over the place, and that's just what I do on a day-to-day basis, am I still getting my needs met? Is there still a level of peace in my life? Is there a level of calm? And if not, being able to investigate a little bit more deeply. And then empathic listening. Am I listening to react? So typically, when we're listening to each other, we might not know how to actively listen or might not be listening at all. And then sometimes we might want to rush through the conversation and react. I want to tell you what to do. I want to tell you how you should think. But in the event you find yourself doing that, there's a possibility that you're certainly not empathically listening if you're listening at all. And so the way that you do that is being able to check in with yourself to say, am I listening to react? And if you are listening to react, what purpose is that? For the sake of learning. So learning opportunities like this event, there are different moments where it's great to learn and it's going to be uncomfortable to learn in order to ask the uncomfortable questions. So I'm encouraging everybody to lean into that space of being a little bit uncomfortable, because if you're not willing to be uncomfortable, then you're not ready for change on any level. And so with that, it's going to be clumsy to go through that process, whether it's asking questions that you don't want to appear offensive, but being able to simply label it and say, I have a question. It may be clumsy, but I certainly don't want to offend. So this is usually in a process where you're looking for connection, but you want to get it right. Now, every time you talk to somebody, it's not going to be a space where you want to connect. But in moments like today, you're going to want to seek that out, but it's going to get clumsy. Lean into that moment and say, I want to accomplish this, but I don't want to offend. Maybe you can help me in that process. And then by that time, the conversation starts. And so inviting a community and reflection, this can be anyone in reference to family and friends, asking the question, does this cause harm? This is really important because sometimes when we're ready to give and volunteer and put ourselves on the line, we might be caught up in the mechanism of what we're doing without considering, does this inmate come across as volunteering, but did I say something that does not challenge my own personal bias? Did I say something to encourage me to say in my safe space in that regard? Does this cause harm? So these are self-reflection questions for yourself, as well as posing those questions to other people in your family, or et cetera. So some of the things that we talked about today is the definition of mental health, the definition of mental illness. We talked about trauma. We defined the two types of trauma, which is acute trauma, which is the single exposure to the event, as well as trauma 2. Well, type 2 in reference to the complexity of that trauma. And then we also discussed intergenerational versus transgenerational trauma. I showed you the picture of the water and the rock, and how intergenerational trauma is a single exposure, including the 3 generations of family. And we also talked about the transgenerational trauma in reference to the transference of the emotional and physical pain after the 4th generation of the family that's removed from the initial exposure to that event. We also talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. And we looked closer at the case study and how those things play out with Karen. We also looked at her treatment and her intervention, and we also discussed what are some concrete things that you can do to challenge yourself as well as others around you. So to bring it to a close, I wanted to leave you with, in order to endure the healing, we must unpack along the way. And that's it, if you don't have any questions.
I'm curious about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. We understand the slave trade and slavery as a collective experience. Is this a syndrome that is experienced collectively or as an individual?
So this is a theory that's more or less to give more of an idea of things that are Black experience in reference to how we understand it. So connecting it to the descendants of someone who's come through chattel slavery in reference to our community and how we've developed adaptive behaviors in response to that. And even though that event is really removed from us now, we still see a lot of the behavior play out, and there's a lot of disconnect in terms of exactly where it comes from, but there's more information to kind of put a finger to say it could be coming from the breaking process of the no passage. And as a response, how do we deal with that in the community as we see it so it doesn't create more dysfunction?
I applaud the work that you're doing. As a community, we don't often deal with the issue of mental health. And so it's really encouraging to see the work that you're doing, because it's often looked at in disdain and shunned, and it's just really not addressed, whether in church or in the community and social organizations, and even in families. What other encouragement would you give? Are there resources here that are available to actually plug people in? Because I think they're really lacking in our community. And so I want to take, I'm taking some hope away from what you're saying, but I have a background, my master's is in counseling. I did social work, child protective services, and so I've seen that firsthand, and I'm just really hopeful by the work that you do. And I want to know what direction that I can send others in.
And so one thing that I think is important when people are ready to seek treatment, understanding how that treatment is going to match what you're looking for in that outcome, because typically by the time they see a therapist, they're going to be treating it through the lens of the complex trauma and through the lens in terms of the theory that they're using for practice. So if you're looking to connect your Black identity in reference to your traumatic experience, that has to be something that's vocalized by the time you're in treatment to your therapist. And the therapist also has to have that framework in reference to the level of importance of coming from a collective group of people that have possibly experienced generational trauma and how that's going to connect to your current experience. So by the time you're seeking treatment, have an idea of what you want to tie in, whether you want it to be long-term or short-term, and then being able to have concrete things in terms of what you want to focus on in past trauma, because your Black identity is going to be very vast in reference to what you want to focus on. But if you're noticing that there's a generational trend where there tends to be molestation, and you're wondering if that can connect in reference to your African-American identity or explore that, the therapist would need to have a framework on how to do that to be able to meet your needs. So being able to voice that when treatment begins.
The idea of empathic listening, I feel like my generation that we struggle with actively listening and constructive conversation, the idea, I guess, I don't know if it's because of technology or social media or something that's going on, but I think that we struggle to form genuine human connections. And I know that in conversations, sometimes I catch myself when I'm talking with somebody, I think, oh, I can add this when she's done or once he's done, and that'll forge a connection between a similarity of experiences that have occurred. But sometimes it doesn't do that because then I'm actively taking myself out of the conversation and trying to prepare a response. So I'm not listening at that point. So you kind of touched on the ideas of, am I listening to react or am I listening to respond? And so in my thought process is a reaction is something that's focused on the self, but responding is something that's constructive to the conversation and contributing to the conversation. Is there like a way to kind of check yourself, I don't know, maybe not using as many I verbs when you respond, or I don't know, is there a way to kind of use an approach that can really focus that within the conversation, or?
So there's a lot that you said in your statement that I want to comment on, so if there's any other pieces I left out, forgive me in advance. But I wouldn't regulate that component of not listening to just younger people. There are older people that tend to not listen all the time. So that's not regulated to just people like you, so don't feel bad about that. But we are in a space where we're not asking as a collective, especially when it comes to different ethnic groups, the impact of social media and the internet and how it's and what that mechanism is. A lot of times we want to make the general assumption, well, it's helping. So since it's helping, we're not going to ask any in-depth questions in reference to how it's hurting, how it's camouflaging, how it's doing some silencing, how it's some level of intimidation there, because as soon as you say it, we can trace back what you said and we can use it against you later. So I think there's a lot of different moving parts to that as well. But by the time you're on the internet and you're searching for connection, also being able to tap into where's my balance in that question that I asked, what are your needs in that? Because by the time you're on Facebook or by the time you're on Twitter, that's a place where it doesn't really harbor a whole lot of connection unless it's a specific movement to push it forward. But if you're not outside of that and you're just commenting on what somebody else said that you disagree with, and it's causing an emotional reaction for you, understand what that is. What is that emotional reaction to trigger you in some way, and what's that trigger? Now, by the time we're on the internet ready to respond, we're not thinking in-depthly about anything. We're just, we just need to hurry up and say this real quick. But if you're looking to have a more productive way to encounter it, being able to say, what response is it having for me? And then what do I want to gain out of this interaction? What's the goal for me by responding to this? And then when you do create that response, at least you'll have an idea like, well, my initial goal is to connect. My initial goal is to try to come in there with some level of clarity and understanding, not to label, not to finger point. So that's what I'm going to go with. And your response should look a little bit more, it should look a little bit different versus attack. Thank you.
I also really appreciated your presentation and the work you're doing, and agree it's really important. I had 2 or 3 thoughts as I was listening to you, which I just wanted to share, see if you have any thoughts, or just throw it out for future discussion as the day goes on. But because you covered so much really important ground. So the first thing I was thinking about is how I've used this book that some of y'all may be familiar with in my classes, Medical Apartheid, which is a really devastating account of how racist the medical establishment has been towards communities of color, particularly the Black community. So it occurred to me that the reluctance to seek therapy, is addressed in that book because that's one of the primary sites of some of the complex trauma, PTSD, that folks are having. So to have folks like yourself or physicians actually help folks, help people when they come in is so necessary as we integrate those institutions. And I had a quick thought. Some of us academics are dealing with this new high theory that people really like of Afro-pessimism. I personally struggle with it because it's kind of weird. It occurred to me maybe some of the Afro-pessimism, when you describe the effects on the African American community of complex trauma, the worthlessness, sadness, the hopelessness part, I was like, is there a possibility? It's just a thing I was wondering if those are related. I've never made that connection before. My final thought was the post-traumatic stress, the post-traumatic slave syndrome, which we've definitely been hearing about, and I think it's important you bring it up. It made me think about how that 400 plus years of slavery affected white people, and if that might mean that there's another thing you might have to call post-traumatic entitlement syndrome or something. Like, how has this affected white people? I just wondered about that too. Focus, for good reason, this is on Black community. But sometimes I think, not your job, but some other people need to figure out how this affected other people with these phenomenon of making phone calls to the police, some barbecuing and all that kind of stuff. Those are the thoughts I had listening to you on the show.
And so with that, you're talking about, where's the syndrome for white people in relation to feeling some level of grief in relation to?
I was thinking more entitlement. Like, so
Okay.
If the effect of being enslaved is one thing, what's the effect of being from the enslaving class, or being from the class that got all these unearned privileges, which I think probably has another set of different complex traumas. It's a different kind of thing. I don't need to equate them, because that would be false too.
But then the person of that descent would have to identify with saying that there's a problem there and there's a problem that's present and that's currently affecting them. So if they're not making that connection, in reference to saying, you know what, I also was affected by slave trade as well because I'm on the opposite end of that. And I think there's some harm that could potentially be causing, even though I'm in the mechanism of doing, you know, I might not be thinking about how is this perpetuating me to just kind of stand still, even though on the outside it looks like I'm doing something that's beneficial. But I have to be in a space where I'm considering change, I'm willing to be uncomfortable, and I'm willing to self-reflect a little bit in order to get to where I want to go and take that into my therapy session, into treatment, and say, you know what, this is something I want to focus on with my treatment. How long would this have to be? Would it be a long time? And then how do I put that into practice when I interact with my family, you know, in terms of person and environment? Because if I have this type of way of thinking, there's a possibility that I could be in an environment that supports that. So even though I might change as a white person, hypothetically, if I go home and everybody still holds those same traditional beliefs, something in that environment would have to shift as well. So it would first have to start with the person to say, no, I'm also affected by slavery, but I'm affected on the opposite end, but it's hurting me in a different way and it's playing out, but that's something that I want to explore. But if you're not in that space of wanting to consider the pain that has also caused you, then there's not going to be change happening.
What I really appreciate about your presentation is that you empower people to go into the driver's seat of this. And I think too many people shy away from dealing with mental health because they feel like I don't want to walk off into this can of worms. I don't know that I'm going to be ever healed. It's like a lifelong commitment that I'm going to make, but you're encouraging us to think, to go into a therapy session and say, you know, I want to get there. How long is it going to take? Give me a timeline. Give me something that I feel good about before I commit. Which is, I think, there's not enough talk about that either. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think what's really important is that the change has to happen before you get to the therapist appointment, because you have to decide. So if you're not deciding on a level of change before you even make that appointment, then there's a possibility you pursue the appointment, sit in the session, and the therapist has to sell you on the idea of change. But we can't sell you on the idea of change. You have to want it and decide to pursue it, and then we assist you along the way. And that's why when you're looking to pursue healing with whatever traumatic event happened in your life, it has to be customized to whatever you want out of that treatment. So, you know, you might come in there and you might have been just going to customize it to what you want to do and being able to push you a little bit forward in that process to make lasting change. But the change is a part, the therapist component is just a small component to add to the larger scope of options on what should be there for you to change. But the therapy definitely helps get you to that point, but you reinforce the things that you're learning in therapy or putting it into practice with people that you're interacting with.
Last question. Really great questions too. I think it'll be great during lunch. I was just gonna quick change in the schedule. Our next presenter, Ward Churchill, he's actually gotten caught in traffic and he's not able to be here. We're just gonna go ahead and move on to the next presentation, which will also actually can help us get on with lunch too. So our next presenter is Estella Chen Quinn, and we're gonna go ahead and be getting her presentation up there right now. So just hang on with us for a few minutes while we get that up. I'll go ahead and read Estella's bio here for us. Estella Chen Quinn is a genetics professor in the molecular and cellular biology department here at Kennesaw State University. She studies cancer genetics of the mitochondria. She attained her PhD at Yale in developmental biology, studied population history of the Amerindians as relayed by mtDNA, and worked for a short while in the Center Genetics Network at Johns Hopkins. And again, we're going to be pulling up her presentation. The title of the presentation is Who Are Americans? DNA Testing for Ancestry and So I think we'll see. Give us a few minutes, we'll get that pulled up. Also, please welcome Estella.
Okay, well, thanks. And, I just got in too, and I got stuck in that construction pressure. But it's great to hear that very interesting presentation that you just gave. So I'm going to present a genetic paper that was published in submit a sample, and then they can give you information about your DNA history, the history of your DNA. Right, so I'm going to try to clarify the semantics of that testing because the semantics get really muddled. And I was first invited to this, I guess, this presentation by Stephen because when he was making a documentary on African American families and Native American ties, he did genetic testing on himself and I think an uncle. So he just wanted to know, how true is the data and how do you really know? And I will say that the paper looks at all the people, the DNA of all the people who participated and consented to have their DNA sort of used in research as well. And nobody's, like in the paper, it's not, there's no identifying information, it's all group stuff. But I will say that towards the end of my presentation, I present one slide that looks at what we call the X chromosome ratio to other chromosomes. So ladies, you have 2 X chromosomes and men only have an XY. And so from that, they can tell a pattern of chattel slavery and exploitation and rape on women. So I hope that's not a painful slide and just we're talking about intergenerational, transgenerational trauma. Like I've always wondered, and I often hear a note of this angst in the African American community, and just I'm not African American, but I am a woman, so I hope it doesn't. I'm just giving you a fair warning. We don't want to hide anything. Okay, so what's in a DNA test, and how is it related to claims of cultural or genetic identity? So when we're saying, I'm Chinese American, what does that mean? So I want to clarify the distinctions between the two. And so this is just a shot of some of the results that Stephen got when he came back with, that he got back from 23andMe. And so the blue, the different colors, this is the picture of the chromosomes, 23 different chromosomes. And the colors of each chromosome segment are associated with a particular geography. And I will emphasize geography. So the blue shows European chromosomes or chromosome sequences that are associated with European populations. And then the red show chromosome sequences that are associated with West African populations. The gold or orange are South Asian, and so on. And then I guess the gray is just sort of unknown. And I do want to emphasize that, so you can't see it, but the text that 23andMe puts in the report, this report predicts the ancestral origin of different parts of your DNA. So it's not necessarily saying, what that person is. It's just, when the sequence is given, then it's just saying something about kind of the genetic history of that part of the DNA. And so, in the news, like when Elizabeth Warren got into trouble because she did DNA testing, and I don't know exactly what she said originally, but she got into political trouble and disturbed, made the Cherokee Nation mad. And so, this is just a couple of paragraphs from a Forbes magazine article. But I highlighted in red some of I wanted to clarify the semantics of it, how easy it is to confuse. So this part, what might sound like somebody is claiming to be Native American, and I don't know if she really claims to be Native American, but this phrase down here, DNA test to prove Native American ancestry, those are 2 different sentences. Right? One claim about ancestry, or in my genetic mind, where do your chromosome pieces come from, versus being Native American. And then also I highlighted here in red, the clarification that the Cherokee Nation wanted to make too, that, your citizenship is rooted in culture and laws and not in your DNA. And And so the same thing applies to me, you know, so I was born here, my parents immigrated from China. As far as I know, I haven't done the DNA test yet, but, you know, I'm 100% Chinese chromosomes, but I am far more American than I am Chinese, and I can't speak Chinese. I love Chinese food, but, so that's how I see the genetic test as well. Okay, so then when Stephen did his testing and he approached me, you know, this was sort of his main question: how do I know the DNA data is true? I said he's studying his family history and he has stories of Native Americans among, you know, his ancestors. And so, what if it conflicts? What if the DNA testing conflicts with family history? So I will say that DNA testing tells us different things about our family history. So you're more familiar with paternity or maternity tests, you know, that's just one generation, so we can easily say something. And when we're looking at a sequence along a chromosome, we're looking for something that we call identity by descent. So kind of like a fingerprint, and how much of that fingerprint can you tell came directly from mom or dad. You could go up further a few generations, general questions about a person's ancestry or linking you know, cousins or second cousins. So you share, let's say you share 50% of your DNA with each parent, or 50% of your DNA with each full sibling, 25% of your DNA with grandparents, or 25% of your DNA with half siblings, and you know, it just kind of, you know, half with 1/8 of your DNA with second cousins, and so on and so on. It keeps going down. So you can kind of say things about that. And then even going farther back in history, lots and lots of generations. And then you're broadening the scope, you know, populations instead of just family. But then the inferences get a little bit vaguer or less direct. So then we're asking questions about the population's history. That's what a DNA test can tell us. And you have to test lots and lots of people, right? If you want to say something about a population, you have to test the population. You can't just test. Okay, so a typical genotyping test or sequencing, when I say sequencing, it might come from this sort of, they call it a bead chip, like a little computer chip, and they can sample lots and lots of sites on the DNA. And so here is an example, you know, DNA sequence. We all have the same chromosomes or the same genes on the same chromosome. Like this is the sequence of chromosome 1, and then we have different people. Fatma, Waleed, one. That's my dad's name. There are two my students' names. I just made up Gary. But you know, we all have the same genes, but you might have different versions of the genes. Right? Whereas the cactus on my porch doesn't have the hair color gene. Okay, and then the mutations that they're looking at are called SNPs for single nucleotide polymorphism. And so the sequence data, they kind of like collect all the parts that are differing between different people, whereas all these other ones in black, like they're all the same. You know, that's what makes us all, you know, 99% of our DNA is all the same. That's why the same species. And then there are the small percentage of our genome that's different. That's what makes us different from each other. So they look at the SNP differences. And some of the SNP differences can be associated with populations. So, so this cartoon is just showing, like I'll call this green population, you know, historically European populations, and maybe the green SNPs are found in common with people of European descent. And then over here you have Native American populations, and there are SNPs that we call of Native American geography. And then in African populations, or when we say African chromosomes, you know, they've been kind of first discovered or associated with African populations. And there's a lot more diversity associated with African chromosomes or populations, just because those populations are ancient. So for my postdoc, I studied population histories and just I'll have another slide, but African populations are like 500,000 to 1 million years old, whereas most of the other world's populations are like 20 or 30,000. So that's why there's a lot more genetic diversity. All right, and then how do we know those SNPs are really associated with the ethnic groups? So this is one project called the 1,000 Genomes Project. It is paid for by the NIH. But they collect samples from different volunteers. They collect history about of your 4 grandparents. Are they all from the area? Is your family from the area? Just trying to get a sense of how long has your family been there. And so presumably the best reference populations for establishing what are your reference SNPs are the volunteers whose families have just stayed there for years and years and years. So that's how we begin to know which SNPs are associated with ethnic groups. Okay, so from that bead chip, they sequence different people. I mean, this is the collection of SNPs from 10 different people. So this purple person, African-American one, I think that's a child, and then here is one African-American. But maybe this is the mother AF1 and this is the father AF2, and they can see that their child is a hybrid. And then I don't know who. All these different colors are different folks. That's J. Craig Venture, who invented whatever sequencing. All right, and then they look at all the mutations or SNPs, and they can divide them up. All right, so these are all the SNPs, 14 million. These are unique to different people, like their own personal mutation. And then these are unique, I guess, novel to the database, newly discovered. And then these are associated with ethnic groups. All right, so all of us have like a mix of our mutations. Some of them we share with people of the same ethnicity, and then our other SNPs are just our own family SNPs, and then others are just mine. So also getting to how do we know that like an ethnic specific SNP is really an ethnic specific SNP? I have to teach you a little bit of biology. So in all of us, we have 2 sets of chromosomes, like from mom and dad. I'm just going to say this chromosome is from mom, and this chromosome is from dad. And then when it comes time to make your own egg and sperm, we go through a process that we call recombination, where the chromosomes exchange DNA. And so here you can see, like these chromosomes exchange DNA, and then, so you're making your own gametes, time to have your own children. And so then your own children are going to get some chromosomes that are a mix of their grandparents' chromosomes. And so here's an example. So say if this were Stephen's chromosomes, and his father, had a light green chromosome and a dark blue chromosome, and his mother had a pink chromosome and a red chromosome. And then, from the egg that he came from, the egg had this kind of mixed chromosome 13, and the sperm had a mixed chromosome 13. So I'm going through this because that recombination happens every generation. And so we have a young population, like European populations or a Native American population, young meaning like 20 to 30,000 years old. Then you have less time to be combined. So you have longer chromosome stretches of those ethnic specific SNPs. Whereas for ancient populations like African populations, they've had 500,000 years of recombination going on. So those ethnic specific mutations are shorter chromosome segments. So, and it takes a long time for these ethnic-specific mutations to rise to frequency in the population, right? So if like 90% of an ethnic group is going to show this sequence, and you want to call it, this is an African sequence, it can take like 500,000 years to get there. So that's why, we're all sort of, well, we're not all American, but like we travel a lot, right? Our families travel a lot. So how do you know a mutation is really African? Well, it's hard to disrupt that 500,000 years that it took to get that mutation at high frequency in a geography. Okay, so we can finally get to the paper. So this is a paper from 2015, and it's titled "Genetic Ancestry of African Americans." And so the cohort that they're looking at consisted of 23andMe customers, so 51,000 individuals almost, about 1970 African Americans, 2,900 Latinos, 45,700 European Americans. It was a web-based questionnaire, and it asked the person, asked them a survey about their own family history, ethnicity survey about their self-identity, and that was modeled after the U.S. Census, nomenclature, and then they gave their state of birth and their current zip code. And asked, would you want your data to be used in research? You don't have to. And then they also asked a second question on identity. What best describes your ancestry and ethnicity? So they asked it twice just to see how consistent someone self-reported. And so from that, if they sort of changed their mind on the second question, then that they estimated an error rate. Okay, and then so this is just some of the text from their survey, just to clarify their intent, right? And so I put it in red again. So the definitions of race and ethnicity used in research are the same as the U.S. Census categories, meaning medical researchers define race and ethnicity socially rather than biologically. So this survey seeks to understand how you identify yourself in terms of these socially defined categories, not a genetically defined category. But your answers will help 23andMe understand the genetic diversity of these categories, and it could help medical research as well, right? So if the doctor is just collecting information about a culturally defined category, but it could help researchers understand the underlying genetic diversity in that socially defined category. All right, and then a lot of complicated stuff. Okay, so this is just looking at the sample sizes of African Americans in this study. And from the participants from the West states, Midwest, Northeast, and the South, and give a sense of the size of the cohort. So from the southern states, Alabama, Texas, and so forth. Then we had 1,000 or more individuals who are participating in the study. And then just look at the chromosome segments and which chromosome segments are associated with the geography. So of African Americans from southern states, then their chromosome segments, 77% of their chromosome segments are called African, and then 21.9% of their chromosome segments are associated with European ancestry, and then 0.6% of the chromosome segments are associated with Native American ancestry. And it looks fairly similar for other African Americans in other parts of the U.S. But it gets a little bit lower for, I guess, African chromosomes. Here, this is showing the length of the chromosome segment. So again, the younger the population, then the less time they've had to recombine those chromosomes that are combined. So you're going to see longer ethnic specific chromosomes with younger populations. And then these slides are showing the number of tracks in self-reported African Americans and the length of the ancestry track. Right, so the gold dots are Native American ancestry chromosomes. The red dots are European chromosomes, and then the blue dots are African chromosomes. And so this is showing that most African Americans in this survey had just short tracks, but then some of the tracks in the genome get longer and longer. So those are sort of the more specific, ethnic specific chromosome segments. Here, this blue dots, so those are the longest tracks and of highest percentage in African American genomes. So this is the length of the chromosome tracks in Latino Americans. And so more of their chromosomes show either European chromosome history. There are some Native American chromosomes, a little bit higher, and then the blue African chromosome tracks are of lower percentage and lower length. And then self-reported European Americans, you can see their European chromosomes are higher, and then the track length is also long. All right, so just looking at the population histories, they can make some inferences about what might have happened. So in genetics, when we have sort of population mixing, we call it admixture. So just looking at those sequences in the chromosome segments, it was consistent with initial admixture between Europeans and Native Americans like 12 generations ago. We estimate, something like 300 years. And then African admixture, like 6 generations or 150 years. All right, and then flip to my notes. Feel free to interrupt me. I know I'm sort of spinning out all these numbers. So this slide is kind of, it's not offensive, but it's sort of sorting people according to their chromosome makeup. Okay, so this is the proportion of African ancestry, proportion of African chromosome segments. Right, so folks down here, most of their African chromosome, or most of their chromosome segments are all of African descent. 98 to 100% of their genome is of African descent. And then, moving on down over here, folks in this bin here, they're 0 to 2% of their genome come from the African continent, from some other continent. That's how they're sorting folks. And then the colors represent, how they identify themselves. Right? So in general, there's a lot of congruence between how people self-identified and then also what their DNA history said. Right? So just maybe here, among just people of mixed ancestry, then there was a mix of self-reporting. So of the blue bar graph, those are folks who self-reported as African American, and then of the orange bar graph, those are people who self-reported as Latino, and then the red is participants who self-reported as European. Okay, so that's looking at African chromosomes. And then this slide is about looking at Native American chromosomes. Again, sorting folks or binning folks by their how much of their genome was Native American ancestry. And again, it's, if you knew you were Native American, yeah, your genome was pretty much Native American. But as your Native American DNA went down, then your chances of self-reporting as something else. Okay, and then just looking at like African American individuals in Georgia versus Washington, D.C. They did see like a difference between Southern African Americans who live in the Southern northern states versus more northern states. So this is the African ancestry or the chromosome makeup. And so African Americans in Georgia, self-reporting, their African ancestry chromosomes are sort of higher percentage of African mutations. Whereas among African American participants in Washington, D.C., their chromosomes had a larger spread. Some folks in D.C. had 25% African chromosomes from other places. All right, and then this is just kind of similar information, but looking at the whole U.S. map. Okay, so this is all just looking at African American participants and then their geographic distribution. And so this blue picture is looking at the amount of African chromosomes in these participants. And so, Stephen was good at noticing, South Carolina is the strongest in African chromosomes. And then he's like, that was the slave port. Oh, okay, well, that's informative. So it makes sense that we would have the highest concentration of African chromosomes in modern populations there. The states in gray, they didn't have enough people participating, so we don't have enough data on that. And then this yellow slide is looking at the Native American chromosome content in African American participants. And so you can see the darker colors coming that are associated with the southern borders. And then, European chromosomes in African American participants mixed, but higher in the northern states. I'm gonna see our moderator here, so okay. All right, so just looking at the X chromosome bias and ancestry distribution. So they're just comparing the X chromosome ethnic distribution versus the rest of the genome. And so in this slide, they're looking at, is there an increase or decrease of the X versus the rest of the genome? And so if there are more mothers or more women who contributed to the descendants, then you would see that, ethnic signature. And so among self-reporting African Americans, then there was an increase of the African X chromosomes relative to the rest of the genome, and also an increase of Native American X chromosomes relative to the rest of the genome. But for European chromosomes, there was a relative decrease. And so there was a similar pattern among other participants, Latino Americans and European Americans. So again, they're confirming the history of exploitation, also in frontier settings. So the men who would go to the frontier, right? There weren't many women. Women tended to stay in the home country, but we also know about a history of rape and exploitation. Anyway, well, I will stop there. Time for questions.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Can you put your conclusions up just so we can look at them?
Okay.
So are you essentially saying that people's memories culturally and their genetics generally line up? There's sometimes a surprise, but a lot of times there's a congruence between the two.
At the population level, there has been a lot of congruence between what they self-report and then what the DNA says. Yeah.
With some exceptions like Elizabeth Warren.
Well, and it may not. I think Elizabeth Warren was a victim of the semantics, right? So it's hard to, she might have said Native American ancestry, but people heard, I am a Native American, and then she had to clarify that, or she might have said, I am also a Native American, and the Cherokee Nation had to correct her.
More importantly, I want to ask you, is there a limitation of the actual collection of samples to compare to? So if we have insufficient genomic sampling from native indigenous communities or African communities, are we missing those similarities? I noticed in Stevens, I think it said 65% were unrecognizable.
Yeah, right.
So that means it doesn't mean that it's something anomalous about him. It means they haven't collected relevant data
Very
for him to relate to, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
So they're giving us the impression on TV that you do this test and you know who you are, but it's really only know who you are in relation to who's willing to share their data and where they've collected so far, which is probably mostly industrialized population.
Right. How good the reference populations are, right? And so they have very fine-tuned information about like European populations, even down to, Britain, this part of Britain and Scotland, whereas I don't know how good their DNA is about like China, but I bet it's not that good. So I submit it, I'm going to be a lot of gray. I think she had her hand up.
I'm interested in the privacy of this information.
Yeah.
So I see in this study, people elected to participate, but at least in California, we see a lot of use of the DNA data in order to combat crime, for example. So somehow it's made public. Like they just caught this guy called the Golden State Killer using DNA data that he voluntarily contributed to one of these sites. So I think that's a concern for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I know in my family, there are people who don't want to put their information here, send their sample. Like, where's it gonna go? What's gonna be done with it?
Well, so, and the tricky part is that I don't think it was even his DNA,
Yeah, but
it
his
was
half
his,
sister was.
right, it was his relatives.
Yeah.
So the relatives consented to, I can use my DNA and then they can trace back through public records.
Yeah.
The problem with genetic information, that there are multiple heads involved. Yeah. I think she was next and I'll do,
Real quick, I'm still skeptical about this DNA testing.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid of falling into the trap of the guy in the commercial that says, well, I have to switch my Lederhosen with it. And I've heard a report recently about a set of twins that did the 23andMe and filed their testing, and they still tested differently. So there was no explanation. Is that enough reason for me not to trust or to just take this with a grain of salt or as entertainment?
I don't see what entertainment would be the most emotionally satisfying. I think it's kind of the same as, how we think of ourselves. Like my child, don't tell anybody, but my child came from a Korean egg, but his father's DNA comes from his father, and he doesn't know, but he's still my baby. Maybe we'll tell him someday. So I think it could be as sort of upsetting as, you have a DNA test and you find out you're adopted or you're really not so-and-so's son. But that doesn't mean that you're really not, he's still my baby. So I don't know if that helps answer your
But
question.
that 50% confidence, I would probably stick with that one rather than going to the 90% confidence, because that one's going to get even more.
So the confidence interval is associated with so we meaning researchers associate these SNPs with this reference population. The larger the reference population, the more confident that can be that SNP is associated with this population.
Okay, guys, I'm sorry, it's a little bit short, but I want to go ahead and give everybody enough time to eat. So Stephen, if you could wait for like 30 minutes, you could go ahead and warm up here, please. So, not only has Stephen put the Symposium together, basically by himself, but he's doing it on I'll go first, I guess.
sorry if I cry. I'm at